colleagues, Ranking Members Bush and Jackson Lee, and distinguished members of Congress. ATF is, in some respects, much like the guns that it is supposed to regulate. In a vacuum, ATF is neither inherently good nor inherently bad. It depends in large part on who controls it and the ends for which its power is exerted. Like all branches or forms of government, ATF is imbued with certain coercive powers that can be wielded either properly or improperly, and for either constitutionally sound or abusive purposes. ATF is not some natural-born villain. The agency was neither conceived in constitutional sin, nor did it come out of the executive branch womb covered in iniquity. It has the potential for tremendous good, and at its best, ATF plays a vital role in keeping Americans safe from violent crime. Unfortunately, ATF also has a habit of turning into its worst self when left unsupervised by Congress for extended periods of time. And that's a problem, because at its worst, ATF tends to use its vast and often unchecked regulatory powers to accomplish through agency rulemaking the very types of unreasonable and unconstitutional gun control measures that elected officials couldn't accomplish through the process. The litany of recent abuses is long. Just last year, ATF, at the prompting of the president, implemented a zero-tolerance policy for violations by federal firearms licensees that has dramatically increased the number of licenses the agency revokes. Where the agency used to see itself as partners working with FFLs to ensure compliance with the vast array of federal gun laws, almost overnight it turned itself into an antagonist. The new policy presumes that many violations merit revoking that many violations merit revoking a license absent extraordinary circumstances, even for first-time violations. This zero-tolerance policy often applies to situations that are basically clerical errors or paperwork mistakes that don't result in any actual harm. And this is particularly ironic given ATF's propensity for sloppiness with its own firearms and records, which has sometimes resulted in actual harm. As Mr. Bosco explained, ATF also told potentially millions of American gun owners that despite a decade of ATF assurances to the contrary, their pistol-braced firearms were actually heavily regulated short-barrel rifles. And if these gun owners want to keep their pistol-braced firearms without immediately being branded as felons, they'd have to register each gun with the government and pay a $200 per gun tax. Otherwise, yes, the ATF is coming for their guns. In another recent rule change, ATF decided that Congress hadn't given it enough regulatory authority and decided it would rewrite federal law altogether. Whereas Congress said ATF could regulate firearms, anything readily convertible into firearms, and the frames and receivers of firearms, ATF told gun owners that actually it could, without any supporting statutory authority, also regulate almost frames and almost receivers. In addition to increasing the number and complexity of records that FFLs must maintain, ATF told them that these records must now be maintained indefinitely instead of for 20 years as under the old rule. And why, you ask, did ATF impose this tremendous burden on FFLs? Well, because it might help the agency in 0.002% of gun traces where having records older than 20 years might meaningfully further an investigation. And not all of ATF's malignant actions are recent. Federal law generally prohibits the importation of firearms and ammunition, except for those that are useful for sporting purposes. For decades now, ATF has maimed and mutilated the definition of sporting purposes in a purposeful attempt to inhibit Americans' access to commonly owned and constitutionally protected semi-automatic rifles. Despite the fact that millions of peaceable Americans routinely use these firearms for legitimate sporting purposes, to say nothing of other lawful uses, ATF continues to defy reality by insisting that they are not, in fact, useful for the sporting purposes. To be clear, Congress should not undermine ATF's legitimate efforts to enforce federal law and stop violent criminals. But it should absolutely step in to restrict ATF's discretion as to where it should focus its efforts and how it should wield its vast regulatory powers. It can and should consider statutorily undoing ATF's recent and not so recent attacks on the Second Amendment rights of peaceable Americans. You've asked us today, when is enough enough? How long, O Lord, will ATF continue being its worst self at the expense of peaceable Americans? Respectfully, the Constitution provides a clear answer. It's enough when you say it's enough, and it will continue until you do something to stop it. In my written submission, I've outlined a number of specific ways in which Congress can begin undoing ATF's problematic attacks on the Second Amendment and the separation of powers and prevent the agency from using these same abusive tactics in the future. I look forward to your questions on these important corrective actions.